You're listening to Finding Fortitude, a podcast that aims to help former athletes take good care of their minds and bodies through sustainable, evidence-based health habits. I'm your host, Dr. Tori Williams, a physical therapist, coach, and fellow former athlete who is ready to be part of the change in healthcare and who is on a mission to learn and share about all things health and well-being so that you can be equipped with the knowledge and tools to live your best life. As a reminder, nothing shared on this podcast should be considered medical advice. Let's get started. All right, hello and welcome back to the Finding Fortitude podcast. I am back today with part 2 of my story about my experience developing and managing foot and ankle pain earlier this year when I was training for a half marathon. In the last episode, I gave you some background information about me, my injury history, and some of the things that may have contributed to why I developed this pain. And I did that following the general line of questioning that I tend to ask my clients when they come to me with pain so that we can really start to gain a better understanding of their symptoms and also, of course, start to carve out the pathway forward. So if you haven't listened to part 1, I think there's some really valuable information in there. I definitely recommend you go back and listen before listening to this episode so that you have all of the context you need to be able to follow the rest of this story. For those of you who have listened to part 1, welcome back. We left off at the point in the story where I had really flared up my pain and made it feel worse than ever after playing an extended amount of pickleball one night after Joe and I lost for the first time in our recreational beginners league pickleball. And we wanted to keep practicing and learn from our mistakes so we could be better. It was really just a classic case of being blinded by perhaps some athlete pride and accidentally overdoing it, which, happens to the best of us. But today I'm going to get a little bit more into the weeds about how I managed this thing after that moment, especially knowing that the half marathon I had signed up for was now only 6 weeks away. So if Joe and I weren't physical therapists, I imagine this is probably the point in which I would have sought out some outside help and potentially would have consulted with a physical therapist because the pain I had officially caused a significant disruption in my lifestyle and in my livelihood. And as a physical therapist, I know that tends to be when most people reach out for help, when they realize it's gotten to a point that's unmanageable. Luckily, because I am a physical therapist, I was able to self-assess and have a fairly good idea of what was going on. And even though it was really painful at the time, especially like first thing in the morning or after getting up from prolonged sitting, which that pattern continued, I had the knowledge and experience to realize that it wasn't a serious issue and it wouldn't necessarily require any further medical treatment if I managed it correctly moving forward. That being said, I do think that seeing a physician or a physical therapist when you experience pain that really disrupts your quality of life and ability to train or participate in the activities that you want to do can be crucial because it can help you diagnose and treat your issue appropriately. Especially in the case of running, you want to make sure that you don't have what's called a bone stress injury that would require a period of rest in order to heal or some other specific medical treatment, right? But in my case, I knew I was not dealing with that and that I was dealing with a condition that's widely known as plantar fasciitis. And although you'll still hear it called this, the field of musculoskeletal medicine is actually started moving away from this name because whenever a word has the suffix itis at the end of it, it essentially means that the condition is primarily caused by inflammation. And then we assume that that condition will then go away when the inflammation goes away. But we now understand that plantar heel pain, pain at the bottom of your foot, can actually last longer than a typical acute inflammation cycle, and it can be accompanied by breakdown of the plantar fascia and some other tissues on the bottom of the foot over time. So it's now being referred to as plantar fasciopathy, which is, a disease of the plantar fascia, or more broadly, just plantar heel pain. because there are other tissues at the bottom of the foot and around the ankle than just the plantar fascia. Now, for some, this is just semantics, but this change in terminology is actually pretty important because it can inform how we treat the condition. So instead of just resting it, icing it, massaging it, and taking anti-inflammatories to really treat the inflammation, it means we also actually need to progressively load the tissues of the foot and the ankle to help it heal, and to help it adapt and recover. So knowing this and realizing how poor my tolerance to load was at the time after flaring it up, I knew that I had some pretty important decisions to make about my half marathon training moving forward. I needed to decide if I still wanted to participate, and if so, how I was going to navigate training and adjust my expectations. Because even though 6 weeks sounds like a long time, I knew it was not going to be enough time to really calm down my heel pain and continue to increase mileage at a rate that would really prepare me for this half. So this is tough, right? Because we come down to a decision of, okay, do I continue to do the thing or do I not? And that can be challenging because everyone's journey is different. Everyone's body is different. So it typically involves a lot of gray area. We'd love it if decisions made around training or returning to sport were black and white. Like, if you do these things, you perform these exercises and adjust your training in this specific way, you will be 100% in X amount of time, and you can go back to doing your sport without any pain or problems. I wish it was like that, but unfortunately, it's usually much more complicated and individualized than this because humans are complicated. Anyone who tries to oversimplify it and guarantee you results in any way is usually trying to sell you something. Remember that. However, that being said, there are some general guidelines we can use and follow based on the general prognosis of certain conditions and some factors that we can manipulate to try to get you back to activity as quickly as possible. There's just no guarantees at the end of it. And we will likely have to adjust things along the way based on how you respond. Ultimately, what I tell my clients is that it's your body and your life. So you ultimately have the autonomy to make the decision for yourself about whether to keep training or participate in your sport. But my job is to be a guide for you along that process by providing you with the information that you need to be able to make an informed decision. And that includes discussing your prognosis, your treatment options, expectations, and the potential risks, and then providing you with support along whichever path you choose. So coming back to me, because I had an understanding of all of the information I just discussed with regard to plantar fasciopathy, and because I knew that my personal stress and sleep situation was likely not going to improve until after my wedding, I knew it was pretty unlikely that this pain was going to go away in the 6 weeks before the race. I also knew that I signed up for this race for fun, and I wasn't competing against anyone except for myself. So ultimately for me, it came down to two options. One, I could either bow out of the race now, just focus on letting the pain calm down and slowly loading the foot as tolerated, which could potentially lead to some quicker healing and recovery. Or option two, I could continue to train for the half marathon with a focus on managing the symptoms and with some boundaries put in place to make sure that I maintained a certain quality of life and that I wasn't significantly worsening the condition or causing any other injuries in the process. And with that second option, of course, I knew that this could potentially mean prolonging the issue. So I decided that I wanted to mess around and find out. And I decided to continue training, see how it went. And I gave myself full permission to drop out of the race at any time if I felt the need to, even if it was at the last minute. Because like I said, I was doing this for fun and I figured I'd just see where we got. So I gave myself about a week off of running after the flare-up. And then I slowly reintroduced running through walk-jog intervals again. And I did my best to progress mileage at the last 6 weeks, even if I was walking for most of it. And honestly, that was challenging. It was also just a really busy time in my life getting ready for the wedding. As I mentioned earlier, my sleep and my stress levels were not great, and my energy and dedication to running reflected that. And I did have some new pain pop up along the outside of my ankle after one of the longer runs that made me consider dropping out, but that ended up resolving itself and being pretty mild. So ultimately, I did run the race, as some of you know if you follow me on Instagram, but I really did have to shift my mindset and my expectations given how my training had gone. And I think this is something I want to spend a little bit of time on the rest of the episode because, yes, the physical limitations are there. They're very real. They're palpable. But I think the mental aspect and the mindset associated with dealing with injuries and training is perhaps even more challenging and something that I don't think is talked about enough. And I see it over and over again in my clients. So let's talk about that a little bit. When it came to mentally preparing for this race, I tried to be really intentional about not letting my athlete ego take over and just try to push through or compete with Joe or my friends who were running the race or try to get a new PR. And I really took the approach of just showing up, giving it my best effort within certain predetermined boundaries that I had set for myself, and aiming to finish the race, period, without making my condition seriously worse or injuring any other body part. So the race started at about 7,000 feet elevation and finished at about 62,000 feet. Oh, excuse me, 6,200. Ha, girl math. So despite the relative decrease in elevation, there was still plenty of long, and I mean long, uphill climbs. And for reference, where I live just north of Sacramento, the elevation is about 250 feet and it's relatively flat. And we did do some elevation and hill training, but the vast majority of the training that we did took place locally at low elevation and pretty flat. So that alone was already like humbling, I will say. But anyone who runs long distances understands the whole idea of mind over matter, particularly as it relates to continuing to push yourself when you're tired or you're hurting. But I think there's a different subset of skills, what I'm going to call mental fortitude skills, that are required to run a race or compete in something when you've been actively dealing with an injury, especially when you have naturally like the ingrained mindset of a competitor who just wants to push through. And I do think these skills apply in a lot of different scenarios, and I think they're important skills to have when managing pain and training with pain in general. So the first one that I really think is important to have is self-awareness. It is crucial that you're able to self-reflect and be honest with yourself about what your body currently can or cannot handle. And this part sucks. It really does. It's not fun to acknowledge your limitations or your weaknesses, but it's often key to being able to actually move forward instead of continuing with the all or nothing mindset where you either go all out or not at all. I've seen many former athletes who really just don't want to admit their limitations, which again, I completely get. There's absolutely no judgment or shame here, but they just end up continuing to push hard because that's what they've always done. And if that behavior goes unnoticed or unchecked, it can unfortunately lead to some pretty tough, persistent pain cycles. And some will end up getting surgeries and procedures that, in my opinion, oftentimes just serve as Band-Aids, unless they're able to actually address the deeper problem of managing load more appropriately, and taking a little bit better care of their body moving forward. So using me as an example again, I had to be really honest with myself about my level of preparation and my tolerance to running in order to really set some appropriate boundaries and some realistic expectations for the race. My longest training run was 8 miles. So I knew I was going to be doing a fair bit of walking during the race, and I had to be okay with that so that I wouldn't make myself significantly worse or injure anything else, which I've said before was like my main goal from this. I also had to be okay with the fact that realistically, even with committing to more walking, a pain flare was definitely possible after the race. I am usually pretty risk averse, but knowing my body and knowing my training and knowing all of these things, I was willing to accept all of this to still go out and participate. But if I had just completely ignored my current limitations and gone out and just pushed myself as hard as I could without any boundaries or parameters, I think I could have ended up in a much worse situation. A great quote by one of the pioneers of self-compassion research named Kristen Neff says, "Painful feelings are, by their very nature, temporary. They will weaken over time as long as we don't prolong or amplify them through resistance or avoidance. The only way to eventually free ourselves from debilitating pain, therefore, is to be with it as it is. The only way out is through." End quote. I love this quote. And honestly, if I had $1 for every time I told a client that last part, the only way out is through, I'd probably be a millionaire. It sucks, but it is so true. And of course, I don't think Kristen in this context, to be clear, was talking about pain in the same way that we're talking about it, but it applies so well. Resisting or avoiding our limitations and our pain really just gets us nowhere. And if anything, it digs a deeper hole for us to climb out of afterwards. Now, along with self-awareness, it's also really important to make sure that we're practicing self-compassion. If we are always quick to judge and shame ourselves based on our physical limitations, which we tend to do as former athletes, it's going to be really hard to accept them and work with them in order to move forward. So we have to let go of this idea that our physical performance somehow defines who we are or what we're capable of. And even though we're always going to be our own harshest critic, being compassionate to yourself just acknowledges that your worth as a human being is inherent and that you don't have to do a single thing to deserve love and respect. And self-compassion is not about letting yourself off the hook, right? Self-compassion is about understanding your thoughts and behavior. It's understanding the actual very real things that impact how you show up. Pain being one of those things. And let's be real, you wouldn't talk shit to someone else who's dealing with pain, so why would you do that to yourself? Make it make sense. So, self-compassion, that's a big one. Lastly, another mental fortitude skill or practice that can be really game-changing for anyone dealing with pain is gratitude. I realize that for some people this idea still sounds woo-woo or like toxic positivity, but let's talk about it, okay? We have some pretty solid research evidence that shows that practicing gratitude regularly can actually change your brain and the way that you see things in the world. And our perception is everything, particularly when we're dealing with pain. We cannot separate the mind and body. It doesn't work that way. So our perception is everything. And again, this doesn't mean we're engaging in toxic positivity and everything's sunshine and rainbows. Things can still suck, right? And it can be frustrating. And we can acknowledge that it sucks that you're not currently able to do what you want to be able to do. But there's still always room for gratitude, even when we're struggling and when we're in pain. It's both and. So for me, instead of dwelling on what I couldn't do during this race, I really chose to focus on what I could do and what my body was doing for me. This came easier for me than it might have in the past because I have been pretty diligent the past few years about having a consistent gratitude practice. And during the race, I was able to tap into that and tap into gratitude for the fact that I was still able to travel 13.1 miles on my own 2 feet and in an absolutely beautiful place with beautiful weather and with my new husband and some of my closest friends. I am a true nature-loving girly, which you probably know if you follow me on Instagram. So I kept taking out my phone and like taking pictures and videos of the views along the course. And it was just beautiful. And ultimately, I really just allowed myself to be present in that moment, to have fun, and to stop taking it so seriously. And really to celebrate the win of finishing the race, even though it looked a lot different than my first half marathon and took me about 48 minutes longer than it did the first time. But I still did it, and I'm still pretty damn proud of myself for it. So these are just a few of the mental fortitude skills that I use and that I teach to my clients that can be really helpful for learning how to take good care of your body and train with pain without completely wrecking yourself. And like I said before, I think these are especially important as a former athlete who likely has some high expectations for themselves and perhaps has some all or nothing thinking habits that they need to break that tend to get them in trouble. And if anything I've talked about in this entire 2-part episode series, whatever you want to call it, has resonated with you, I would highly encourage you to make sure that you're signed up for my email newsletter list, where I will be releasing the details soon for my upcoming course on how to navigate chronic pain and get back to desired physical activities. I will make sure to leave the link for that in the show notes so that you can stay in the loop. So to wrap up this episode, I want to be perfectly transparent and tell you that I did, in fact, flare up my heel pain after this race. I was not perfect with keeping to my predetermined boundaries that I had set before the race. I did not realize that the first basically mile and a half we would be running downhill, and I had no pain. I felt great. I had, the race adrenaline pumping through my veins, and I kept going. And that low-grade pain that I was feeling during one of my longer runs before the race, or that I felt after the long run, it did reappear, and it hung around for about a week or two after the race also. But with that being said, after the race was over and my wedding was over, I was able to take much better control of my load management and my recovery. And over time, things have significantly improved. I am happy to report that now, a few months after the race, I've gotten much stronger and I'm much more tolerant to running and higher impact activities. And the daily pain has improved so much to the point where I usually don't even feel it during the day once it's warmed up. It's not perfect, and the rehab process has definitely not been perfectly linear, but it never really is. And I tell my clients that all the time, so now I'm having to remind myself of that as well. Now, before someone comes after me, I want to be crystal clear that I am not sharing all of the things I just shared with you to say you should do exactly what I did. Because truthfully, everyone's situation is different and everyone has a different comfort level with risk. This is just something that I was personally comfortable with, and I was also willing to take radical responsibility over the potential consequences. And I hope that regardless of where you are on your own chronic pain journey or your own personal risk stratification, that there are still some things that you can take away from my story and my experience. And my hope is that one of the biggest takeaways from today is truly that what you decide to do with your body is always ultimately up to you. But with that, I hope that you understand the importance of making decisions about your body from an informed place, of first understanding your pain and what's going on with your body, and then making decisions that align with your own personal goals and values. And if you're someone who frequently finds yourself wanting to stick your head in the sand and ignore your pain and just keep pushing onward without any real structure for how to deal with it, I truly hope that you someday seek out help from someone who specializes in this stuff, who can help guide you and empower you with the tools that you need in order to move forward and really live your best life. And that is not someone who is going to instantly tell you to stop doing the things that you love. Unless there is a serious safety reason for that, there's always another option. There's always more nuance. So if you are ready to do that now, and you're ready to take the next step to move forward, I'd love to see if I can help you. I will leave the link to sign up for a free discovery call with me in the show notes, where you can find out if working one-on-one with me is right for you, or you can shoot me an email or a DM on Instagram to chat. All right, that is all for now. Thank you so much for tuning in to this 2-part episode. If you found this episode helpful, please do me a favor and leave a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts, and maybe share this episode with someone who you think might benefit. It's a great way to support my mission and my small business for free, and I would greatly appreciate it. I've got some really awesome guest interviews lined up for you the next several podcast episodes that honestly you're not going to want to miss. So stay tuned for those. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening. Take good care of yourself, and I'll talk to you again soon.